Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the world is slowly fading into a muffled, terrifying silence. Now, imagine that your entire existence, your passion, your livelihood, and your legacy depend entirely on your ability to hear. What would you do? Most would surrender to despair. But one man chose to fight back. He took the silence, wrestled with it, and forged it into some of the most powerful, earth-shattering sounds the human race has ever known. This is not just a story about a musician. This is the story of an absolute titan of human willpower, a man who revolutionized art while trapped in an invisible prison. This is the extraordinary, tragic, and ultimately triumphant story of Ludwig van Beethoven, the genius who heard the universe in his mind when the world went quiet. Born in December 1770 in the city of Bonn, young Ludwig did not have a fairy tale childhood. His father, Johann, was a harsh and demanding man who recognized his son's immense talent early on. Johann was desperate to mold Ludwig into a child prodigy, a second Mozart, and he pushed the boy relentlessly. Legend has it that Ludwig would be dragged out of bed in the middle of the night to practice the clavier, weeping over the keys. It was a brutal beginning, but it forged an iron discipline and an unparalleled technical mastery within him. Music became his sanctuary, his escape, and his only true companion in a cold world. By his early 20s, Beethoven had moved to Vienna, the undisputed musical capital of the world. He didn't just arrive, he exploded onto the scene. Vienna had never seen or heard anything like him. He wasn't polite and refined like the classical musicians who came before him. He was fiery, temperamental, and wildly intense. When he sat at the piano, he didn't just play the instrument, he commanded it, sometimes hitting the keys so hard that the heavy wooden mechanisms and strings would snap under the force of his passion. He was a rock star of the 18th century, captivating aristocrats and commoners alike with his dazzling improvisations. The world was at his feet. He was wealthy, famous, and destined to be the greatest composer alive. But then, right at the peak of his early success, a dark shadow began to creep over his life. It started as a faint humming, a strange buzzing in his ears that would not go away. At first, he tried to ignore it, brushing it off as a temporary ailment, perhaps a fever or a cold. But the ringing grew louder, more persistent, and more terrifying. By the time he was 28, the horrifying truth became impossible to deny. He was losing his hearing. For a musician, there is no crueler fate imaginable. Beethoven was terrified and deeply ashamed. He withdrew from society, avoiding gatherings and parties because he couldn't bear to ask people to speak louder. He lived in constant, agonizing fear that his enemies and his rivals would discover his secret and ruin his soaring career. The psychological toll was devastating. In 1802, he retreated to a small country village called Heiligenstadt, hoping the peace and quiet would cure him. Instead, the isolation brought him to the very brink of the abyss. He wrote a deeply personal and heartbreaking letter to his brothers, a document known today as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In it, he confessed the absolute agony of his deafness and admitted that he came dangerously close to ending his own life. The despair was complete and overwhelming. But in that very same letter, a miraculous shift occurred. He wrote that it seemed impossible to leave this world before bringing forth all the music he felt inside his soul. Art, and art alone, held him back from the edge. He made a conscious, defining choice to live, to accept his tragic fate, and to completely conquer it. Emerging from this darkest hour, Beethoven entered what historians now call his heroic period. If the physical world was going to deny him sound, he would create a universe of sound entirely in his own mind. The music he began to write was completely different from anything ever heard before in human history. It was longer, vastly more complex, and charged with an explosive emotional intensity. He wasn't just writing polite notes for wealthy people to enjoy at dinner parties anymore. He was writing massive, sweeping dramas about human struggle, heroic sacrifice, and ultimate triumph. His Third Symphony, the Eroica, shattered all the established rules of classical music. It was unprecedented in its scale, its length, and its sheer physical power. With its two massive opening chords, Beethoven essentially declared war on the past and single-handedly ushered in the Romantic era. And as his hearing continued to rapidly deteriorate, his inner ear only grew stronger, more vibrant, and more visionary. He composed the iconic Fifth Symphony, with its famous four-note opening that sounds exactly like fate knocking violently at the door. He wrote his beautiful Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, meticulously capturing the sounds of a natural world he could barely hear anymore, from the bubbling brooks to the crashing thunderstorms. To continue composing, he had to resort to extreme and desperate measures. He sawed the legs off his piano and sat on the floor, pressing his ear to the wooden floorboards so he could physically feel the vibrations of the lowest notes traveling through the room. He began to keep conversation books, carrying small notebooks wherever he went, where his friends and visitors had to write down what they wanted to say while he answered them aloud. He lived in a state of chaotic isolation, his apartment a notoriously filthy mess of scattered manuscripts, unemptied chamber pots, and half-eaten food. He became known as a supreme eccentric, a mad genius wandering the streets of Vienna in worn-out clothes, wildly humming to himself and waving his arms as he composed invisible masterpieces in his head. By his late 40s, the silence was absolute. He was profoundly, completely deaf. He couldn't hear the slam of a heavy door, the crash of nearby thunder, or a single, solitary note of a piano. Yet it was exactly in this world of total, impenetrable silence that Beethoven reached his absolute peak as a creator. He transcended the physical limitations of the human body and tapped into something utterly divine. He wrote his late string quartets, music so advanced, so mysterious, and so profoundly spiritual that even today, centuries later, musicians consider them the absolute pinnacle of Western art. It was music written not for the ears of his contemporaries but for the ages. And then came his absolute crowning achievement, the Symphony No. 9. It had been over a decade since he had last appeared on a public stage, but in 1824 he insisted on being present for the premiere of his Ninth Symphony. He stood on the stage, frantically turning the pages of the score and beating time, completely unaware that the musicians were actually following the real conductor, who was standing slightly behind him. The Ninth Symphony was a revelation. It was the very first time a major composer had ever used a full choir in a symphony, setting the words of Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy to Soaring, Immortal Music. It was a massive, euphoric anthem to the brotherhood of humanity, written by a man who had been bitterly isolated from humanity for most of his adult life. When the symphony finally ended, the concert hall absolutely erupted. The applause was deafening, the cheers shook the walls, hats and handkerchiefs were thrown wildly into the air in a frenzy of pure adoration. But Beethoven stood still with his back to the audience, staring out at the exhausted orchestra, still turning the pages of his silent score. He couldn't hear a single thing. It was one of the singers, a young contralto named Caroline Unger, who gently walked over to him, softly took his arm and turned him around so he could see the roaring ovation. When he saw the tearful, ecstatic faces of the audience, the true magnitude of what he had achieved finally reached him. The crowd realized in that heartbreaking, beautiful moment that the man who had just given them the greatest piece of music they had ever heard could not hear a single note of their thunderous applause. Ludwig van Beethoven died 3 years later, during a violent, theatrical thunderstorm in March 1827. His last words were reportedly, "Pity, pity too late," referring to a gift of wine that had just been delivered to his bedside. But another historical account claims he looked up and said, "I shall hear in heaven." Regardless of his exact final words, his legacy was already immortal. He had taken the absolute worst curse a musician could ever face and turned it into his greatest weapon. He proved, once and for all, that true genius does not reside in the ears or the hands or any physical sense. True genius resides in the unbreakable, unyielding, human spirit. Thank you for watching. If you were captivated by the incredible resilience of this musical titan, please hit the like button, leave a comment down below about what surprised you the most about his life, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the lives of history's most fascinating and mysterious figures. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries of the past.